Hi, I'm Shira Carpel.
And I'm Shayna Gaunt, and we're board-certified behavior analysts. At How to ABA, we provide practical resources, community, and support to ABA professionals. In each episode of our podcast, we will be having real conversations with real people, sharing real stories about ABA.
We'll share relevant strategies and actionable tips that will make us all better ABA practitioners. It's the ABA content you need that you're not going to learn in a textbook.
Hi, everyone. Today we are welcoming Ashley Cabral, who is a BCBA who practices in an in-home agency. She's from Massachusetts, and she is coming to discuss with us the topic of diversity, cultural competence in the field. And I think as BCBAs and ABA professionals, we definitely don't have enough training on this. The fact that it was just recently added to our task list just says that it's something we really need to do better on. So I'm really looking forward to having the conversation. So welcome, Ashley.
Welcome. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for having me.
So can you start by telling us a little bit about your background, how you got into the field, and what your role is?
Sure. So as you said, I am a BCBA for an in-home agency in Southeast Massachusetts. I've lived here all my life. I'm originally from Massachusetts as well. And so I started off at an in-home agency in the early intervention department. So I worked primarily from newborn to 3. The primary city that I was servicing in our kind of catchment service area were primarily low-income families, as well as families that are the majority Portuguese speaking. So we've had families from Cape Verde, Brazil, Portugal, and various other countries, but those were primarily the ones that I have or started working with. I am bilingual. I grew up in a Portuguese-speaking home, and so I'm fortunate enough to still be bilingual and still have that ability to communicate in Portuguese fluently. And so when I started early intervention as a developmental specialist, I primarily worked with a lot of families that were Portuguese-speaking. I then started to, over time, get experience with working with families that had children of with developmental disabilities, but primarily ones that showed significant symptoms or red flags of an autism diagnosis. And so that started my journey into autism and learning more about ABA therapy. I worked in conjunction with other ABA providers at the time because our agency did not have an ABA program. And then from there, I learned what a BCBA does, and I learned about the science of ABA, and from there made the decision to pursue, my graduate program and become a BCBA myself. And thankfully, at the time, we were also launching our ABA program at the company that I was in. So I was very, very fortunate to have started, or at least have helped start, opening up those cases in our new ABA program. So that's where I've been. I've been with the company now for about almost 7 years, and our ABA department has been around since 2016. So I primarily have now worked in our ABA program as a BCBA, but primarily also working with Portuguese-speaking communities.
Wow. And I imagine as a family who lives in a country where they don't speak the main language, it's probably very comforting for them to have someone who's fluent in their language, because developmental disability, autism, those are overwhelming enough. And I imagine having the language barrier just makes it that much more overwhelming. What do you see as like the biggest obstacle, facing us as ABA professionals dealing with families who may not speak the same language as us? Like what really is getting in the way there of us connecting and bridging that gap?
I think the biggest gap, and again, I can only speak on behalf of the Portuguese-speaking community, but I'm pretty sure that this is a common thread with a lot of families who do not speak English or are not originally from the States, is information. It really is information. The majority of information that is given to parents that go through the process of getting a diagnosis is primarily in English. So I encourage other BCBAs and other practitioners and behavior technicians in the field to really kind of put yourselves in their shoes. Imagine, having a child with significant developmental delays and concerns for a potential autism diagnosis, and you get them, evaluated and diagnosed in a totally different country. You don't speak their language. You're at a table with a bunch of doctors and professionals giving the diagnosis that also don't speak your language. At times, translators are available. At times, they're not. And even just the written information, I think that's also another barrier, is written information is all primarily in English. So a lot of the time that I spend is simply just translating the developmental report and the letter and what it means, and dissecting that information and really making sure that I'm translating it in a way where, our families can understand and really kind of work through that information. So I think the biggest barrier is just information that is in their native language. I think, that's definitely an area that continuously I feel is a barrier for the majority of the families I work with.
And if you didn't speak Portuguese, or if there was a community that didn't have each other to turn to, or people who were English speaking to translate that, what would your suggestion to other professionals be? So for instance, me, I only speak English. I don't have another language. If I'm trying to service somebody whose primary language is not English, what can I do better as a professional?
I think the first step is really learning more about the culture. I think that's always the first step, is kind of understanding the culture of the country, of the family that you're working with. I think that's always a beginner step, is to be more mindful of, what are cultural norms for them and what are not. But also kind of just encouraging them to seek out, support groups, or even just, different informational sources that are in their native language. So I can give an example. Autism Speaks was my first kind of beginning organization that I leaned on a lot. Autism Speaks, their website really has like the 100-day the first 100 days of the autism diagnosis, and it's translated in well over 25 different languages, I believe, off the top of my head. So I think what I would suggest is knowing what is credible as a BCBA. So what is information that you would naturally give credible information to a English-speaking family, and looking to see how that can be disseminated and translated in that family's language. So I always started with Autism Speaks, and I looked at, what are some of the brochures and information that I have read in English that I know is credible, to then have it, downloaded in a language that, is obviously the language that the family speaks. So I think that's always a good beginner step. And then, looking to see what further information needs to be, looked at or gathered from there.
I think it's really important as practitioners to remember that different cultures approach autism, developmental disability very differently. You mentioned working with people where autism is more of a taboo, and it's not something that they really even want to discuss or want to approach. How can we as practitioners, on the one hand, be sensitive to that because it is a cultural difference, but on the other hand, we want to help and we want to make change and we want to improve lives. So what's your suggestion there?
I think the biggest thing that I was told once before by a BCBA that helped me kind of really have the perspective to break down the diagnosis is that autism is not it's of course can be altering to someone's life. Of course, the diagnosis obviously presents with difficulties, but it's not a death sentence, right? It's just a different way of learning. It's a different way of absorbing information. And the way that I like to present it to families that are just kind of starting this journey is that, your child learns just in a different manner, in a different way, and they process information in a different way. And so I primarily start by really breaking down what the diagnosis is. I know in a lot of Portuguese-speaking countries, the feedback that I've been given by families that immigrated from there have mentioned that, to them, autism, like you said, is very much a taboo. It's very much a it can also sometimes be seen as almost like a curse or, a bad omen. And so a lot of that has to be kind of disseminated and kind of digested through. But again, a lot of it is just teaching them that the diagnosis comes in so many different ways and shapes and levels and severities, and just kind of working from there. And again, we have to be mindful as practitioners that these families are coming from countries that don't have ABA services. And if they do, it's hours away at a local hospital or clinic. We also have to be mindful that these families are primarily, have been exposed to maybe other medical conditions in childhood that they believed, oh, well, that's just what they have, right? It's something medical, it's something physical. I think the biggest thing there is just to be sensitive to what medical experiences in countries that they've lived in have been, and kind of just being more compassionate with that first.
Yeah, that's so important. I always remember one of my first clients who were not native to, we're in Canada, we're not native to Canada. And, me as the ABA professional wanted to teach, eating and sitting at a chair and eating with utensils and all of that. And it was this family's culture to sit on the floor and feed with their hands. And we kind of have to, it was a bit shocking because as a young professional, I was like, well, that's, they're here, like they're in Canada. They need to learn how to use a fork. But you know what? Maybe they didn't. And I think having that cultural sensitivity is really important, especially when we're going into people's homes. We're in their space. They don't have to do things our way. Just because this is how we are familiar with things doesn't mean that's how we have to teach our clients to do things. And I think it's really important that we remember that going into our clients' homes and spaces.
Yes, absolutely.
Such a good point, though, Shira. And, Ashley, you said at the beginning when you were talking that one of the things that we should be doing better is just right from the get-go, understanding other people's cultures and starting there. So it's not just about the language and the translation issue, but it's the cultural nuances as well. So if we can, just dive in a little bit and say, oh, in this culture, they see it as this, or in this culture, this happens. What's your experience with, or being able to say, I don't know about that, or not I don't know about that, but I don't know about your culture, or can you tell me more? Are parents open to you? I mean, when you're going into the Portuguese culture, they welcome you because you're Portuguese, but if you had to go into, another language speaking family and say to them, listen, can you tell me more about your culture? I'm really interested so that I can learn more and help you out that way. Is that a good thing to do, a bad thing to do? What's your experience with that?
I think it's a great thing to do. Again, coming from working with so many families that are Portuguese speaking, one of the biggest comments or feedback they've given me is like, wow, she actually took her shoes off at the door. She actually wanted to know more about my culture. She actually wanted to know more about, our upcoming religious holiday that's coming up. Parents really enjoy when we take the time to just be humans and really just understand someone's culture. I mean, I have the experience, thankfully, working in a city that is so broadly so culturally diverse that I have worked with families from, Arabic speaking, countries and areas of the world. And, I had a family that, was Arabic speaking. And of course, I don't speak Arabic, but I was able to understand what was important to them. And it was the little things like taking shoes off at the door, sitting on the floor, just watching, their interaction. And over time, I got to learn so much about the culture being in their home. I think that's also the other great thing about working in homes is you can really see, culture there, that it's such a cultural, rich environment to be in. And so I just encourage practitioners to really absorb that. Do they have a dining room table, or do they have an area where they sit on the floor to eat? Do they have, utensils or things like that? What is their customs and what are their traditions and what is important to them? So that way we can help navigate that relationship and really build that rapport with the family.
Yeah, I think it's so important now for those of us who are supervising, new BCBAs in the field, where this is a new concept. And so much of our training and of what the focus is when you're learning to become a BCBA is on like the theoretical and like the textbook stuff. And they have to learn how to tact and mend and do all those things. And I wonder what we could do better as supervisors in the field to better train our own supervisees to be more sensitive to this. And I guess it depends on where you work, because those of us who work in a clinic or who work a little bit more remote from families are a little bit more far removed versus those of us who work in home. Is there something that us as supervisors could be more aware of, whether it's, pointing people into the right direction for resources in their language, or whether it's noticing those things in the home? Like, can we better prepare our next generation to be better at this?
Yeah, I think definitely for sure, the access to information is always kind of the top, starting point for sure. But I do always encourage my behavior technicians to really make sure to have, the parent present or the parent nearby when they're doing, programs and let's say they're doing a matching program. If the parent can just simply even watch the program be run, or watch to see and observe, what are the specific ways or strategies that we're really using to teach their child a specific skill. Surprisingly enough, I've had parents tell me like, oh, I did that thing that, the therapist does with those cards and he did it. So they really do feel very empowered when they can even just watch, right? So there's no communication there, there's no translation there. It's just simply observing a program be run or a skill be taught. That parents, surprisingly enough, absorb that and they practice outside a session without sometimes us even knowing until I have like parent training with them and they're like, oh, I tried these cards and I tried that Velcro thing that you guys use and it worked awesome. So I just encourage that, even just involvement, physical involvement of parents, just simply watching and being engaged in session, I think really goes a long way. And it doesn't necessarily you don't need a translator for that. You don't need someone to translate, what the SD is and what the target you're working on, right? So I really do encourage a lot of practitioners, but also just behavior technicians as well, just to be mindful of that. Parents really absorb a lot of information that way too.
Wonderful. What advice would you have for a newly minted BCBA?
I think as a newly minted BCBA, what's important is, like what we've discussed before, we learn all this terminology. We learn all of these textbook kind of, protocols and things to try. I just really encourage, newly minted BCBAs to really have that compassion first. I know that at times we're so eager to try, this treatment and have all this terminology and this jargon, right? But I really do think it's important just to take a step back, get to know the family first, get to know, what their concerns and priorities and their needs are, and really be more compassionate, with what they're struggling with. We, like I mentioned before, we have a lot of families that are of low income families. So do they have every toy that we would love to have to work on with their child on a particular skill? Of course not. But we're not going to come from a place of judgment. So I think, the biggest thing is just to be compassionate and meet the family where they're at, right? So if you this is your first time meeting your new case or your new family, just meet them where they're at. Where are they at? Do they need more time to process what diagnosis was just given, or do they have more of an approach where they're accepting of the diagnosis and they're ready to kind of jump into programs and teaching? So I think just making sure to have that compassion first, but also meeting where the families are at, and not just jumping into programs and parent training and teaching, because just as we stress the importance of rapport with our learners, I think that rapport is equally as important with our parents as well.
Absolutely. We're not just pairing ourselves with reinforcement with the student, we're pairing ourselves with reinforcement with the entire family. You're right, because if we want generalization, if we want the ultimate goal to be parents learning this and parents taking over, then we really need that buy-in.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's really important to know, like you said, where they're coming from and meet them where they're at. I work with a lot of families who, similarly, a diagnosis is taboo. Like they don't want anyone to know, and I need to be very aware of that, especially because I may see them, out and about in the community, and certain families don't want me to acknowledge them, and I need to be okay with that. And then there are other families who, if I didn't acknowledge them, they would be insulted. And there's so much sensitivity there because we have to be so aware of where our families are coming from and the backgrounds that they have and how their feelings are about that. And I love what you said about not looking at it as like this diagnosis, as, this is, this whole big, challenge. But let's talk about like what does it look like on the day-to-day? Like forget about the diagnosis, whether or not you have a diagnosis or not, what's working for you, what's not working for you. And let's start small. Like don't get overwhelmed by the fact that your child may or may not have a diagnosis, but how can I help based on where you're coming from and what your culture looks like and what you're sensitive about, and really meet them where they're at. I love that.
Yeah. We also mentioned about the whole cultural diversity, becoming this newer topic in the field that we're talking about, and it shouldn't be new. It's been there all along, but we're just starting to talk about it. Likewise with compassionate care, compassionate care we're really just starting to talk about as professionals, and that's something that should be in the forefront and should have been in the forefront for ages and ages and ages and ages. So I love how you highlighted that as well, that it's about not just pairing yourself with families, but also the compassion and showing them or empathizing with them. I understand why you're here or what this journey, or maybe I don't understand, but I'm not going to judge you for it. And if this is where you're at, I can help you with this journey versus judging you for it or saying, no, you need to be here.
Yes, exactly. And to give, different examples, I have gone into families or new cases that are coming from another ABA provider and that have chosen to switch ABA providers. And one of the biggest things is, because that language barrier is there, that compassionate care can almost sometimes be tricky to do in a way because you can't really connect in the same language sense, right? But I think that's where the training starts, right? Like without us knowing their native language, how can we build those rapports? How can we have an open mind? How can we have more of a presence, a welcoming presence, not a closed off presence where we're just kind of on our computers and looking at graphs, right? How do we spend that time to really get to know the families and connect with them in a way where they are trusting of us and that they are, feeling that we are there not just to support their child, but also to support them and their concerns and, what they are going through as a family, possibly even just getting the diagnosis recently, So I think a lot of that is where, I hope the field really kind of dives into a little bit more is how we can better strengthen that as a part of our field.
I'm listening to you and I'm nodding as if people can really see me on this podcast, right? But I think everything you said is so true. And, it does come down to maybe not literally, but, taking your shoes off at the door, walking in, sitting down on the floor with these families and taking that apple juice or orange juice that they give you and drinking it and, being a part of their culture, or maybe not a part of their culture, but trying to, immerse yourself with their culture and be accepting, and so that you can get that rapport and get that relationship before you start anything else.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. It's so important for sure.
Very true. Is there anywhere that we can continue to learn more about cultural competency? Do you have any good resources or directions you can point us in for those of us that want more on the topic?
Well, I think it's definitely a growing area in our field. So I hope to see more kind of social media outlets, pop up where there is more of that support there for us as practitioners. But I do, really encourage, looking at Autism Speaks as a starting point to really kind of get those information articles or downloads to families in a way that they can better understand. But, I'm really hoping that, with our science really working and concentrating on this a little bit more, that we can have, support groups or organizations that can better help or assist around that, that cultural diversity. I think I'm hoping that's where the field goes, and I'm confident that's where the field is going because, BCBAs are worldwide. There are BCBAs that translate. There are BCBAs that are not English speaking. So I'm really hoping that with time, those supports can be in place to better strengthen this skill. But for sure, I would definitely look at some of those, those website outlets and hopefully, we get more of those, those outlets to better support us as practitioners, especially with cultural, diversity and working with, families that are not from the U.S.
Yeah, it's definitely an area of need that I agree. I hope we continue to do better and get better and grow in the field. It's so important. Well, thank you for enlightening us so far with, it's so nice to hear from someone who's actually working in it, actually has that experience. And it sounds like you've been doing it for many years, where some of us might just be catching up. So thank you for sharing that with us. And
well, I also want to say thank you. I think this is, really important. This is kind of our starting point, one of many starting points that our field is having with better understanding how to have more compassionate and more of that cultural acceptance of our families. And I'm so thankful that, you guys gave me the ability to share my experience working with Portuguese speaking families. It's been very near and dear to me for so many years, and I hope to continue this in the future. But thank you so much for giving me the time to really explain my experience, and hopefully this was helpful for BCBAs that are seeking this information as well for their families as well.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And I hope many people learned from it. And I know we did.
Thank you so much, Ashley. It was really great to talk to you.
Of course. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for joining today's conversation. Wherever you get your podcast, please go and subscribe, rate, and review so others can find out about us too.
For more from How to ABA, including free resources and ABA materials, visit our blog at howtoaba.com. And make sure that you're following us on social media for more practical tips and updates.